Good evening, everyone. We'll start now. We have Jagdish Krishnaswamy from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements delivering this lecture to us as part of this exhibition. Just to introduce our speaker, Jagdish is the Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability at IHS. He has a BTech in Civil Engineering from IIT Bombay, an MS from Statistics and Decision Sciences, and a PhD in Eco-Hydrology, both from Duke University. As the Dean of the SES, he leads the build out of school, providing strategic direction and operational guidance to expand its academic footprint, research activities and network, practice portfolio and capacity building initiatives. Jagdish helps in the development of the IHS Kengeri campus as India's first long-term urban ecological observatory and strengthens IHS profile in ecology and conservation science. His research has spanned the entire continuum from semi-wild to the urban, covering the United States, Costa Rica, Africa and India in eco-hydrology, landscape ecology and biodiversity. With that, I invite Jagdish to the stage.
Good evening and thanks for being here. So today I'll just share some of an overview and some insights we have from how we should be looking at the integration of blue, green and grey infrastructure in an urbanizing space. So the reason why we talk about any type of infrastructure, whether it's blue, green or grey, is because it's supposed to help us to solve some challenge. And so these are the sustainable development goals that all of us know about. And any infrastructure, whether it's grey, blue or green, is supposed to help solve some of the problems that these sustainable development goals are related to. So there are 17 of them and many of them are things that are very relevant. All of them are relevant in the urban, but I just want to point out a few things. Clean water and sanitation clearly is something that we all care about. And then you have sustainable cities and communities, which number 11, which specifically is more urban focused. But you also have things related to the climate change dimensions. We have also things related to sustainable development goals related to biodiversity. So you have life below water, number 14, but that's only about marine ecosystems, not about freshwater ecosystems. Life on land is about terrestrial ecosystems. We actually don't have a sustainable development goal for freshwater ecosystems, which is a gap in the SDGs. However, freshwater ecosystems come as targets. For example, target 6.6 under clean water and sanitation is about freshwater ecosystems and biodiversity. But because it's nested under some other sustainable development goals, clearly it will not get the importance and profile that, say, the marine ecosystems get from having an entire SDG devoted to them, 14, or terrestrial biodiversity, life on land. So just to point out that in spite of all the things, all the wisdom and knowledge that went into, and the discussions that went into the sustainable development goals, we do have a gap. And I don't want to get into why countries in their, when they negotiated this and agreed upon this, why freshwater ecosystems was left out of the purview of the SDGs as a goal, even though it's there as targets. So just to show what blue, green and grey, in urban areas we have transformed the hydrology, in some cases even the land surface, to such an extent that, and a lot of it is grey, so it's built infrastructure. We have also transformed the hydrology. Each time we build a road, we also dig a lot underground to put our cables, our pipes and so on. We also have reduced hillocks and done all sorts of things to the topography, if you want to call it that, of the city. And therefore, when we talk about any type of blue and green spaces in the city, they will have to be integrated with the grey infrastructure. So many of our water systems in Bengaluru, for example, they earlier used to have the hydrology of their own, which was very different 100 or 150 years ago. But now, because of the way in which we have transformed the surface and groundwater hydrology of Bengaluru, many of our water bodies actually cannot persist without gray infrastructure, including drains and pipelines and all of that, sewage treatment plants, all of that being connected with our blue infrastructure. So just to point out that green and blue often depend on the gray. And just to also just mention that some of the green infrastructure that we see in a city like Bengaluru did not exist or could not exist 150 years ago, because it's actually subsidized by the water that we import into the city from the Kaveri, and then the seepages and leakages and all the wastewater that we generate out of that clean water that we are importing from a river basin, another river basin, that is then in some sense is subsidizing some of the blue and green infrastructure that we have in the city. So it's already a completely transformed system, and so moving forward we will have to see more integration of these rather than less. So that's just to point out. That is about green spaces. So green spaces can be anything. It could be a garden, it could be a park, Kaban Park, it could be the your Lal Bagh, it could be the GKVK campus. You also have smaller green spaces, neighborhood, smaller parks, and so on. You have tree-lined avenues. Blue spaces are, of course, many of them are the tanks. Now we call them lakes of Bengaluru, originally meant for irrigation, but now used for other purposes. And the gray infrastructure, of course, includes all the pipelines, the canals, sewage treatment plants, and all of that. Then there are these two terms which have become quite common now and quite popular amongst those who are looking at solutions to some of the problems we face in the city, whether it's the pollution of water, whether it's pollution of air, whether it is related to other types of challenges in urban spaces, including the loss of biodiversity. You have this term called nature-based solutions. And nature-based solution is just basically using ecological mechanisms or either managed or semi-natural ecosystems of one kind or the other, either by conserving them, existing ones, or by restoring ones that have been lost, in order to solve some of the problems that are related to the SDGs. So environmental degradation, it could be water quality, it could be water security issues. All of that you could solve through what is known as nature-based solutions. And a subset of nature-based solutions are what are called as ecosystem-based adaptation, which is a term favored actually by the government of India, which is that part of nature-based solutions that specifically relates to climate action in terms of mitigating heat stress or maybe water security under climate change. So ecosystem-based adaptation is a subset of nature-based solutions. So that's just to point out some of the things. So there are many global change that is happening. All of us are aware of that. But I'll just mention a few that are of great concern, starting with climate change, which all of us are grappling with in one way or the other. And in the city, this gets amplified because we also have, in addition to climate warming, we also have the heat island effect, where because of all the built-up infrastructure that we have, the concrete and other surfaces, buildings, glass, those materials can absorb a lot of heat and retain it, and then radiate it back. So sometimes, the evenings, late into the evenings, it's much warmer. So you have heat island effect and climate warming combined, so which can be quite a bit of a challenge. Just to point out that in terms of trends in India, we have actually had a moderate decline in the Indian monsoon since the 1950s. Many climate models have actually not been able to capture this observed decline. When some of our climate scientists attribute the decline in the Indian monsoon, which is most pronounced, as you can see, the most negative values, the trends are in the Western Ghats and a few other places. They attribute it to the weakening of the thermal gradient between land and sea. So, the land was always getting heated up even before climate warming came in a big way. But the seas are also now warming in recent decades. So the thermal gradient between these two has been weakening, and that's one of the important drivers, not the only, driver, but an important driver of the Indian monsoon. Now, at the same time, while this decline has been happening, this trend is there. We don't know how long this will last. Because there is another phenomena that happens with climate warming, as you know. A warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. I think for every 1 degree Celsius increase you can have 7% more moisture holding capacity in the atmosphere. So, plus the rates of evaporation from inland water bodies and the oceans and seas are also going to be higher with warming. So, you have a lot more moisture getting into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere now has a greater ability to hold that moisture, and so the hydrologic cycle has accelerated. So, you're going to actually end up getting more rain in more intense packets. So this is basically what's been happening. So in spite of the variability, the declining trend in the June to November total rainfall that we see since the 1950s, we are seeing that rainfall which is exceeding 150 mm or more per day, or 200 mm or more, those are showing an increasing trend in recent decades, whereas the more moderate rainfall of 25 mm or more, or 50 mm or more, that's been showing a bit of a decline. So overall, we are having, if you have a reduced total, plus you have more of the rain falling in more intense packets, then clearly the number of rainless days also has to go up. So that has also happened. And you have more rainless days, and you have rainy days which are fewer but very intense. So this is a challenge for us. Now, at some point, the decline in the Indian monsoon is supposed to be overturned by this phenomena, which is basically the greater capacity of the atmosphere to hold moisture and to accelerate the hydrologic cycle. At some point, this phenomena might trump over that. And so some climate scientists suggest that there will be a tipping point. We don't know when that will happen, at which point our overall annual totals might also go up. But more of it is going to be in the more intense region. So that's the cause of worry. So that's just to summarize some of the challenges. On the warming side, of course, we all know the story. Those trends, there are no complications compared to the Indian monsoon, which is very complicated. The warming story is quite simple. Like the rest of the world, India is warming, cities are also warming, so that part is consistent with everything we know. So that was the climate change part. The other global crisis that we all are, of course, facing is the water cycle, water crisis. And just to show that we have, this is the global water cycle. And I just want to point out that here the units are 100, the input rainfall in a year is given in units of kilometer cube per year, because we're talking about the entire globe. So it's a big unit. So we have 120,000 kilometer cube per year of precipitation. And then it's partitioned into these different types of water, of which green water and blue water and black water, these are things that's something that should concern us in the city. So green water is that part of the rainfall that can infiltrate into the soil and into the shallow groundwater and can be accessed by plants. So that part of the rainwater that can get into soil moisture at the rooting depth of plants, whether it's a crop or a shrub, tree, grass, forest, whatever, or shallow groundwater that can be accessed by some of the trees and so on, or deep-rooted shrubs also in some cases. That is that water which can be accessed, of course, then that can be transpired by these plants into the atmosphere. So because the water passes through the vegetation, so that's why it's called green water. And so all our rain-fed crops are dependent on green water. So, and then the other part is blue water, which is water which can actually flow. So it could be groundwater, it could be surface water, it could be water in a reservoir, a lake, or a river. Now that is the water that we depend for drinking and so on. So we don't depend on green water for drinking water or anything like that. We depend on blue water for all of this, for drinking, washing, everything else. Even construction of buildings. All of that depends on blue water. So blue water is the one that is been abstracted by us in many major ways. And we already are exceeding the limits in terms of having irreparable impacts on many of our rivers and wetlands, because the blue water that feeds these rivers and wetlands is what we are been abstracting for agriculture. So if we are able to shift some of the requirements of water for agriculture, either by changing the type of crops we are growing, what type of water intensive or less water intensive crops we are growing, if we can shift that, some of that towards dependence on green water and less dependence on blue water, we may be able to put back more water into our blue infrastructure, into our rivers and lakes and wetlands. So that's something that's and then what cities do is that we actually take a lot of the blue water, clean blue water, and we convert it into gray and black water. Black water is nothing but the water that comes out of our toilets, and gray water is what comes out of our kitchens and bathrooms and so on. So that is a precious water resource if it's recycled, and Bengaluru has actually made some strides in doing that. It can be part of the urban transformation, sustainable transformation that we all are interested in. This is just that was a Sankey of the global water cycle. This is a Sankey of the India part of that. So you have input rainfall, and that's 4,000 cubic meters per year, and then there's the green water part, the blue water part, surface water, all of, and then used by industries and so on, wastewater. This is very tentative estimates, but this is something that every city, every basin should be looking at the water cycle in terms of blue, green, gray, black, and everything, and then looking at where we need to move. So we talked about the climate crisis, then we talked about the water crisis. Then we also have the biodiversity loss crisis, as we have had tremendous losses of biodiversity. And why are we bringing in biodiversity in a talk on urban blue, green, and gray infrastructure? Is because if you look at it, currently only 15% of the high priority areas for biodiversity and ecosystem services in India are within the protected area network, that is national parks, sanctuaries, tiger reserves, and so on, which means that 85% are in areas where we probably need to share space with nature and with biodiversity. And cities, because urbanizing areas are increasing in an unprecedented manner, and in a couple of decades, 50% of Indians will be living in some form of urbanized surface. So the sooner we are able to recognize that cities need to play a role in biodiversity conservation. They can't solve the biodiversity crisis, which needs a lot of action in areas which are semi-wild and all of that. But cities cannot need to play a role, otherwise we will not be able to meet the target. So for example, in India, India is committed to the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework, and under the COP15, we have 30% of our inland and waters and marine areas are supposed to be under some form of conservation and restoration by 2030. So to meet this target, urbanizing areas will have to play a role, and there are opportunities for that. So let's just look at some other challenges that we face in the city, and Bengaluru is no exception to that. We've already talked about extreme precipitation. Some of our cities have been battered by some really unprecedented amounts of rainfall in a given day. So some years back, Mumbai had 950 millimeters of rainfall in a single day. And you're talking about an urban area which does not have the ability to absorb even other moderate amounts of rainfall because of the built infrastructure. Then Chennai some years back had 225 mm in a day and a half, which is about the entire northeast monsoon in a day and a half. So, and Bengaluru also. Bengaluru doesn't need that high amounts of rainfall. We have become, some parts of the city have become quite dysfunctional very moderate amounts of daily rainfall. If you have 30 or 40 mm of rainfall in Bengaluru, some parts of the city are going to be in real trouble. So if you get something like 100, 150, then it's going to be really a huge challenge. So of course, we have modified the topography, we have modified the drainage patterns, so we have a completely transformed hydrology of the city. So we can no longer aspire to the original hydrology of 100, 150 or 200 years ago. We do have to deal with what we have now and use the integration of blue, green and gray. Gray is very important. Engineering will be required for us to help solve some of the flooding and drainage related issues. Green and blue by themselves cannot do that. This is just to show the flood risk to cities across India. And if you look at, this is just an example of Vartul Lake. This is the 2022 floods. The lake has a catchment area of 270 square kilometers, Bengaluru. So these are all major sub-watersheds of Vartur. And currently all these watersheds have close to 80% built up area. So this rapid transformation of surfaces that were permeable to rainfall are being changed to. So now you're going to have the ability, you need the ability to transform high quantities of runoff which are being generated simply because it can't be infiltrated because it's all built up. You have to take that out of harm's way. And the only way you can take that out of harm's way is gray infrastructure, which means your drainage channels, your all your canals and so on. So this is again, this is just to show the built up vegetation, water and others, the changes from 2001 to 2020. So urban hydrology is very dynamic and every part of Bengaluru actually requires almost on an annual basis, you need to keep track of the changes in the hydrology of that area. This is just the built up. And also, I know, of course, this is a course map. Every built up area is not the same. Some built up areas are a little better than others because they may actually have the gray infrastructure that takes the water out of that. And just to show the Henegra Lake, which has also undergone a lot of transformation in recent decades. So earlier the built up area was concentrated only in the Jigni industrial estate, but then now it has become much more heterogeneous. So the built up area is now spread throughout the catchment. So there's a major change in the hydrology of that area. Just to point out that the water bodies of Bengaluru, the tanks we used to have, they used to be largely for irrigation purposes. And many of them used to actually let out the water during the dry season. So incoming rainwater in the monsoon would then find space to be stored in these. Now some of these water bodies, some have been of course encroached and they no longer exist. Others, the connections between them and other water bodies has disappeared. And the third is that now some of the water bodies actually have water throughout the year. Either treated sewage is being let in or other water is. So basically because there's no demand for irrigation for many of the water bodies in Bengaluru. So we can no longer think about the way they were managed in the past. But we can draw some lessons about how effective they were in flood management earlier because they had the storage capacity to absorb incoming rainstorm water. Now many of these water bodies are quite full even before the monsoon. So this is just to show the changes in the land use and land cover, built up area vegetation in the catchment of Henegra Lake. So it has increased. The built up area has expanded from 3.3 to 31.6. So that's an order of magnitude increase in built up area. So that's that's a non-linear expansion of the impermeable surfaces when you talk about the hydrological cycle. So you'll have a very non-linear impact on that. And so basically now you have a large part of the catchment impervious surface in 2020. So if you just make a simple calculation as a first cut, a 10 mm rainfall in that catchment would translate into a runoff potential of 3,14,706 meter cube on these surfaces alone, the built up area. So that means that if you have a 10 mm rainfall event in that catchment, you need the gray infrastructure to convey this, this amount of water out of harm's way and somewhere where it can be stored or temporarily kept or whatever. So that's one. And if you have 100 mm of rainfall, you would have a huge amount of runoff that even our grey infrastructure may find it difficult to cope with. So this is just to give, if you want to just look at any part of Bengaluru, then this type of simple calculations will help. I just want to point out that we use the satellite imagery to say that so much of the area is impervious and built up. But there are differences. There's heterogeneity in the built up area in one part of Bengaluru with another. You actually might have small green spaces in some of the built up areas, which would actually allow for some infiltration of rainfall and so on. So they're not the same exactly. But as a first cut, when you have to make an estimate, then this is a good way to do that. All you do is just take the surface, the built up surface area and multiply it by the depth of rainfall, and then you get a volume of water that you need to convey so that it doesn't flood the area. So that is definitely something that we need to think about. This is the flood-prone areas of Bengaluru. And this is a network of, you need to keep track of not just the water bodies and the land use and land cover, but also use monitoring wells, groundwater, surface water monitoring in order to get a very dynamic view of what is the status of water resources. You know that we face water shortages also. We also face flooding hazards from time to time. So we have both. And therefore, our water resource management has to cope with both lack of water as well as excess of water, depending on the context. The other part is, of course, the heat stress. And Bengaluru, although it has advantages of being on a plateau, which is about 3,000 feet high per sea level, and also has had green cover and water bodies, but it still is, as we know, some of our summers have been quite trying in some parts of the city. And therefore, the role of green and blue infrastructure then becomes very important in terms of its potential contribution to heat stress mitigation. So this is just to show that a very large number of people in India are exposed to very strong heat stress. And I just want to point out one thing. It's not just about the temperature. As you know, actual heat stress is a function of temperature and the humidity. And therefore, the wet bulb temperature is what you should be looking at. So when we try to cool, so for example, we can't cool ourselves through perspiration when it's very humid. Similarly, the vegetation, by releasing water vapor through transpiration, is also not able to perform that function when the air is saturated with water vapor. Because what drives the release of water vapor from the leaf tissue through the stomata into the atmosphere is that vapor pressure gradient, which is driven by the differences because it's saturated inside the cell, and outside it, if it's very dry, then that is a driver of transpiration, and then that leads to this latent cooling that we all benefit from. So many of us, when we drive past some of the water bodies, green spaces, in Bengaluru, you would have noticed a dip in the temperature, and that is basically the impact of cooling by transpiration and evaporation of those green and blue places. Now, if you are in a very humid area, coastal parts of India, there are limits to how much cooling we can achieve by transpiration and evaporation, because that will be constrained by high humidity. But you can still benefit from the shade of trees because the temperature would still be lower. So the shade becomes much more important in that, and less important is there are limits to transpiration. Just to point out that when we talk about heat stress mitigation through blue and green infrastructure, we should realize that in some parts of India we can achieve good results. In other places we will still struggle with that because of humidity. This is just to show 2024, the heat wave we had. It was a super El Nino year. As you know, last year was El Nino, then super El Nino we had. And so this is just to show the cooling impact of our green and blue infrastructure. This is a land surface temperature anomaly. What we have done is just subtracted the city average temperature from every pixel. So then you have pluses and minuses. That means the pluses are basically parts of the city which are warmer than the city average, and the negatives are the parts of the city which are cooler than the city average. And we can clearly see that the blue and green infrastructure of Bengaluru did play an important role in mitigating heat stress during the Super El Nino year. Sorry. This is 2021, which was not an El Nino year. So you can see that the city-wide temperature must have been lower also. And so you can see that the impact of, when you compare it to the previous image, you can see that the cooling effect was relatively stronger in the El Nino year than it was in the non-El Nino year. So this is quite a dynamic, the blue and green infrastructure, how it cools the city differs from year to year, because the city temperature itself is going to be different, the transpiration, everything else will be responding to that. So it's quite dynamic. It's not something that you can take one set of measurements and say that this is the cooling that can be achieved in any given year. And just to show built up area, green spaces and water bodies in terms of the mean land surface temperature. Is much better. The land surface temperature values from satellite, the absolute values are often not very reliable, but when you subtract the temporal mean or you subtract the spatial mean like we did, and then use anomalies, the pluses and minuses, those are much more reliable and easier to interpret. But just to show that our Bengaluru green spaces and water bodies, their contribution. So this is just an anomaly map. I just want to show this is 2021. And if you look at the green and blue spaces, their cooling effect is also where these large green spaces and so on are located. And just to point out that the biodiversity of Bengaluru is also linked to many of these green and blue infrastructure. So if we can link our water security, our climate stress mitigation, and our water security. So linking climate, water and biodiversity together, then I think that we will be able to think a little bit comprehensively about how we can find solutions. Because then you can find resources from all these sectors. Because water is essential for us, biodiversity loss, we definitely want to do something about it. And you also have the heat stress mitigation that can be achieved through this blue and green infrastructure. So if we can combine all three, then we effectively are speaking to a lot of the SDGs that we began with. So again, I just want to point out that this is an example of integration of blue, green, and gray, and each has its own role to play. For example, you need gray infrastructure to convey water from, say, groundwater to surface water. You also need treated wastewater to be conveyed to a water body. These are all things that require effective gray, well-managed, well-designed gray infrastructure. And you also need some infrastructure that should be informed by nature-based solutions. So, for example, you have bioswales which connect between water bodies. Those need not be concretized completely. They can also have vegetation in them, wetlands. So this is an example from our long-term urban ecological observatory that we are building in our Kengeri campus. So we have an urban forest, we have the city coming up on other sides, we have a water body, and then we have stewardship of this area. And so we want to make sure that in terms of our water management, energy, as well as our carbon footprint and our biodiversity, contribution to biodiversity conservation are part of our sustainable management of the campus. And hopefully other campuses can also draw lessons from this. So this nature-based solutions is just to point out that this is a term that you will see being mentioned very often. Sometimes people don't understand the nuts and bolts of it. So these are, if you look at the IUCN definition, of course, the fact that it's called a solution means it has to solve some problems. That's the first thing. Is it solving your water insecurity problem? Is it solving your heat stress problem? Is it solving your water pollution problem, or heat or dust problem, or pollution, water, polluted air? These are all city or your solid waste management. Many things are there. So then you need to say that, okay, I have some problem that I need to solve, and I'm going to use the power of either semi-natural or managed ecosystems or modified ecosystems in order to do that. That's all it basically means. And this is just a wider definition that you can think about. The other thing is that it must be scalable and replicable. So if you say that, I can only do it with these set of people on my campus, we are the only people who can do this, and this is not possible to be done anywhere else, then we can't call it a nature-based solution. You must have something that can be replicated by other people, and through maybe some capacity building and so on, but it can't be something that is dependent on outstanding, charismatic, whatever efforts in some unique way in one particular place, and then you say that it can't be done anywhere else. Then it's not scalable, it's not replicable, therefore it can't be called a nature-based solution. So this target, so we need to have 30% of our terrestrial inland water, all of that to be put under some form of biodiversity friendly manner. So then we need to have more areas that come under this, contributing to this 30% target. Now cities can't have large national parks and sanctuaries, although many cities are on the boundaries of them. So Bengaluru also is on the Bannerghatta National Park. On our boundary, we have many urban reserve forests, peri-urban reserve forests, plus within the city we have green spaces. But the scope for having large protected areas inside the city are not there in most places. So apart from making sure that our footprint on neighboring forests are reduced, ecosystems are reduced, Hesarghatta recently, fortunately, has now received some protection, the grasslands ecosystem. You might have seen there was a campaign to achieve that, so it's very happy that it's happened in something in the last few days. We've heard the good news. But if you have urban green spaces, whether it's a campus or a neighborhood garden or even a neighborhood small park or anything which is meant for other purposes, recreation, it's meant for something else, like a campus is meant for housing students and teaching and so on. But if it also, as a co-benefit, it also can harbor a lot of biodiversity, then it can become something called an other effective area-based conservation area. So this is a new type of protected area called OECM, other effective area-based conservation measure. And so this is basically, it cannot be an existing PA, but it can be any type of land and water which is being used for some other purpose, but biodiversity is a co-benefit. And so India's first OECM was this Aravali Biodiversity Park in Gurgaon, where very degraded, quarried out land was converted, restored into a biodiversity park, urban biodiversity park. So Bengaluru has the potential of having several OECMs if we can, again, the integration between blue, green and gray, and if we can get our act together in terms of identifying many of these places, including campuses. So we have been talking about conservation and ecological restoration and biodiversity. The one thing that we have to keep in mind is it's about native biodiversity. And so whenever we talk about contribution to conservation or biodiversity restoration, it's about native species. Urban areas are novel because we actually bring in lots of exotic species from all over the world, and Bengaluru is no exception to that. Now, exotic species also are of two kinds. One, the ones that you bring in for ornamental purposes, for other reasons, if they don't spread too much at the cost of native biodiversity, then they're fine. You don't have to. So like the rain tree in Bengaluru, some magnificent specimens we have, they help cool many parts of the city. They are often found in many institutional areas, hospitals and so on, provide a lot of shade, even support many birds. It's fine, it's not an invasive species, but there are other species which are invasive, both plants and animals. And so when we talk about nature-based solutions, just because we have a green area or we have a lake or a water body, unless it can conserve native species, we can't call it as an other effective area-based conservation measure. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. Bengaluru's water bodies are filled with exotic species, some of them invasive as well. And so when we talk about managing a city like Bengaluru, this is just to show that cities are a part of a larger basin, and so we need to look at a landscape scale or a basin scale approach to ensuring that groundwater, surface water, treated wastewater, all of them can play a role in management of water. And this gray water and black water, we need to convert as much of this as possible black into blue water category. And Bengaluru produces a lot of wastewater, and it's also one of the first cities in India to treat some of its wastewater and start rejuvenating water bodies. It's also using that water for irrigating crops in neighboring districts. It's an interesting experiment. There are, of course, some concerns about the quality of the treated wastewater, its impacts on health, and so on. But it's something that needs to be done better and at a larger scale, because this treated wastewater is a huge resource. As Mr. Vishwanath, who's the pioneers of sustainable water management in the city, he will tell you that if Bengaluru actually treats all of its wastewater, we can actually be, in some sense, exporting water to neighboring areas. So that might happen, but that's just to point out that black water and gray water are very important resource. We also have a huge solid waste problem in our water bodies, which needs to be tackled as well, because that is a big source of contamination, and all types of emerging contaminants and chemicals, hormones, many things, pharmaceutical, many things are getting into our water bodies. So that's a huge challenge in urban areas. So that also requires a lot of attention. When we talk about restoration of urban water systems, we find that our imagination of things like riverfront development or water or lakefront development is based on concretization and channelization, whereas where you can actually have a well-functioning river ecosystem even within the urban context, which can also provide you with the cultural, aesthetic, and other services without constraining the river into these concretized banks. So this is an example from Pune. Some months back, this is the Indrayani River, this is the Mulla Mutta. So there are throughout the country, in cities, wherever rivers are there, this riverfront development is emerging. And unfortunately, the design is more of what you see on the right-hand side rather than what you're seeing on the left-hand side. So that is going to be an opportunity lost. This is just to show that invasive species have to be managed. This is just the Ravi Jambekar, our urban ecologist and artist. He also had an exhibition earlier today here, and this is a sketch of the invasive plants on our campus. So managing and regulating invasive species of plants and animals is going to be very important for our urban ecosystems. So this is whether it's plants or, can somebody recognize the species? Yes, red-eared slider. So very popular amongst aquarium folks who keep aquariums, and then many of them from the pet trade has now entered into our water bodies. Bengaluru's water bodies are filled with it. This photograph I took in Ahmedabad, and almost all the water bodies we visited in Ahmedabad had the red-eared slider, and it's very aggressive species. It can outcompete native turtles. So this is one example amongst many invasive species that are now finding refugia in India's water bodies, urban areas included. So when we talk about integration of blue, green, and gray, we need to think about the ecological dimensions as well. We only talked about urban forests, gardens, water bodies, lakes, and so on. But there is also urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is also a form of green infrastructure. Often we don't think of urban agriculture, urban gardening as an infrastructure, but it actually is quite. In many cities in India, wherever people have some space, including on balconies, including in their backyards, also institutional campuses, there's an opportunity for linking food security, linking, for example, mineral-rich or vitamin-rich fruits and vegetables that you can harvest, medicinal plants, with support for biodiversity, human well-being. So that form of decentralized urban agriculture and urban gardening, where you can also use the treated waste compost available from your city municipal dumps or even your food waste. There's a circular economy that can be built around converting food waste into compost, which can then help support urban gardens and urban peri-urban agriculture. So this is just examples where people have done these things. It can also provide some degree of heat stress mitigation. It also supports pollinators, birds, insects, and apart from lots of contributions to human well-being in many ways, including mental health, everything. Just to show another aspect that studies have shown, we always think about urban areas as places where nature is always in retreat, right? We always have less biodiversity in the city compared to, but when you look at the city as a normal ecosystem, you find that, for example, this is the work done by folks in NCBS as well as in A3, where when they looked at bees, they found that our neighboring intensive agricultural areas outside Bengaluru actually have a lower species richness of bees. And you actually have some urban areas in Bengaluru which have greater ability to support a higher species richness of bees, because in urban areas there are actually some parts of it actually have more floral resources for bees throughout the year because of the type of plants that we keep growing, gardens and all sorts of things, including exotic ones and all. That's one. The second thing is we might actually not be using a whole lot of chemicals in our urban food gardens and so on, compared to the intensive agriculture here, some of which many of the agricultural areas have actually lost bee habitat in terms of shrubs and trees and so on. And urban areas, you might have seen that on the way to the airport or in some other places, there's water tanks, high water tanks. When you look up at them, you'll see the Apis dorsata hives. So many bees in urban areas actually found refugia compared to some of the sites. So this is sort of counterintuitive that we always think of urban areas as something where you will always lose biodiversity, but here we find that there is an opportunity. Of course, bees do struggle with highways and fast-moving traffic and other types of problems in the city, but just to show that there's a glimmer of hope here in terms of the future of biodiversity in urban areas. Again, just wanted to point out that the integration of blue, green, and gray, if it has to be done well, requires a lot of data and information, including sensors, measurements, evidence being collected. So this is the type of measurements that we are able to collect on our campus in order to manage our water resources. We are just, eventually when we will be housing several hundred to a few thousand students on campus, we will then, by then we need to have all these systems, wastewater treatment systems, bioswales, which help to design. Also, apart from native biodiversity, they can also help design to help groundwater recharge, connecting water bodies with bioswales, and then also this using treated wastewater for rejuvenating water bodies to ensuring that we don't release any bad quality water into the neighboring environment. That's our overall goal. And every campus in Bengaluru can actually achieve something like this. It requires quite a bit of investment in monitoring and measurements and experiments also. And there will be some mistakes made, but eventually, hopefully, we will get to something which will help us with our overall goals. So this is just a schematic. Just to point out that green spaces is a black box, right? We say green space. They come in all types of shapes, sizes, and functionality. So the green spaces that can truly contribute to biodiversity conservation in the city must allow for these key ecological mechanisms and the life cycles of diverse sets of organisms. So all parts of the trophic chain, so the food chain, ecological food chain. So that is something, so whether it's an urban garden or an urban forest or a campus, it must cater to all of these. So this is just to show that these are all glimpses from our campus where we have predation, we have birds which depend on grasslands, grasses, and we have fungi, and we have turtles, and we have all pollinators. So these are all things that you need to think about when you're designing an urban campus or a urban green space, a garden. Often the imagination is very limited in terms of lawns and some few ornamental plants and so on, when we could be doing a lot more better. These are just again examples. We have about 140 species of birds on our campus. A few leopards visiting us, slender loris. Hopefully they will persist as we build our campus as well. This is a banyan tree, which is a hotspot of biodiversity on our campus. And this banyan tree is a fig, of course. And as you know, each fig is associated with a species of wasp for its life cycle. And plus, throughout the year, it has a series of insects and birds, which keeps changing in terms of depending on the season. And so to capture all of that, Ravi Jambekar, our urban ecologist and artist, he sort of is a sketch of the different species of insects and birds that are associated with this particular banyan tree. Banyan trees and peepal trees are found in many parts of Bengaluru, and these large trees are definitely irreplaceable losses if we lose them, because they take decades to grow. They also are very important for our urban biodiversity. And another thing is that cities, can be a very harsh environment for biodiversity to persist, and so it needs a little bit of help. So, for example, we have this bee box, this bee hotel on the left-hand side is for solitary bees. So unlike social bees, solitary bees, very important pollinators of many fruits and vegetables. Each one has its own apartment or whatever. So this is, if they can't find sufficient natural cavities, then a bee hotel can actually help bring back solitary bees. Then we have a roosting box for insectivorous bats. Bats in Bengaluru, every day they devour millions of, I don't know how many, of insects, many of which are mosquitoes as well, especially pipistrelles. So they perform a very important role in pest control, not only in agricultural areas, but also for our urban Oman health in terms of mosquito control and so on. So bats are very important, and Bengaluru has about 12 to 15 species of bats. Most of them insectivorous, but we have maybe up to 3 species of frugivorous bats as well. Then we put up this, we didn't have resident spotted owlets on our campus, so we put up this owl box, and then we have now had 2 generations of spotted owlets which have emerged from this box. So this is just a few things. If you provide the right habitat plus a little bit of help, then you can help nature thrive in the city. This is one of our leopards from our campus. So my colleague earlier, he was working with us. He took this picture in an evening on our campus. So one of the 4 leopards that have been visiting our campus. And peri-urban areas of many cities in India have leopards. And this is going to be a huge challenge for us in terms of managing human-leopard coexistence. We hope that we will also be able to. So far, both humans and leopards on our campus have kept out of harm's way, out of each other's way. But we need to manage that into the future. We've had training programs and advisories on how to respond if you see a leopard and so on. So this is something that we'll have to do, whether it's rescuing snakes or whether birds which have fallen out of their nests or leopards. We have to have a cadre of people who can, a rapid response team for every urban area, because this is going to be, if biodiversity and humans have to coexist in a city environment, then we will require all of these specialized services at our disposal. So I'm just going to end here. I just wanted to share a few ecological and environmental dimensions of blue, green, and gray in Bengaluru. So I'm happy to take any questions or any comments or concerns you have.